My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one, the person who keeps things running without making noise. I've been a partner, a stepmother, a professional who meets deadlines early, a woman who remembers birthdays and replaces the empty milk carton without being asked. If you asked people who know me to describe me, they'd probably say I'm calm, reliable, and low maintenance. Some might say I'm lucky. Others might say I'm quiet. What they wouldn't say, because they didn't see it, is that over time that quiet became a kind of disappearance. This story is called I Became Invisible in My Own Home. One choice changed that. It isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense, or shouting matches, or a villain getting what they deserve. It's about something far more common and far less discussed. How a woman can slowly fade out of her own life by being agreeable, patient, and endlessly understanding. How that fading can happen so gradually that no one around her notices, especially not the people benefiting from it. For a long time, I believed that being needed was the same as being valued. I believed that if I stayed calm, stayed kind, stayed quiet, things would eventually balance out. I told myself I wasn't invisible. I was just mature. I wasn't overlooked. I was just strong enough not to need attention. Those stories helped me sleep at night. They also kept me stuck. This video is not about revenge. There is no moment where I slam a door or deliver a perfectly timed speech that leaves everyone speechless. There are no raised voices here. What happened instead was quieter and more final. A series of small realizations. A choice made without witnesses. A shift that didn't announce itself until it was already complete. At some point, without fully meaning to, I put myself first. Not loudly, not selfishly, just clearly. And that changed everything. What you'll hear over the next hour or so is a personal account of how invisibility forms, how it feels from the inside, and how it can be undone without cruelty. I'll walk you through who I was to the people around me, the moments that seemed insignificant at the time, and the internal line I crossed when I realized that continuing as I was would cost me something I couldn't replace. I'm telling this story honestly, not to paint myself as a hero or anyone else as a monster, but because I know how many people are living inside similar quiet compromises. If you've ever felt present but unseen, useful but not considered, if you've ever wondered how you slowly became smaller in a place that was supposed to be safe, then this story is for you. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently, with no expectation of an answer yet. Have you ever noticed yourself going quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because it felt easier than finding out no one was listening? To the people in my life, I occupied a very specific space, one that didn't have a name, because unnamed roles are the easiest to take for granted. I was the one who noticed what needed doing before it became a problem, the one who smoothed transitions, absorbed stress, and translated tension into something manageable. If something worked, no one asked how. If something failed, I quietly adjusted so it wouldn't fail again. At home, I was good with details. That was the phrase. I remembered appointments, handled school emails, tracked household expenses, and anticipated moods the way some people anticipate weather. I knew when to speak carefully and when silence would keep the peace. I knew which days were better for asking questions and which ones required patience. None of this was written down. It lived in my head, and over time, it felt like that's where it belonged. In social settings, I was described as easygoing. I didn't dominate conversations. I listened. I asked thoughtful follow-up questions. People liked talking to me because I made space for them. That ability was praised just enough to keep me using it. "You're so understanding," they'd say. "You don't make things complicated." I took those as compliments, not realizing they were also instructions. At work, my role was clear on paper but similar in spirit. I coordinated projects, which meant translating between departments, absorbing friction, and making sure deadlines were met without drama. I was trusted, I was dependable, I was rarely challenged, and rarely credited. When things went smoothly, it was assumed they always would. When they didn't, I was the one expected to fix it quietly. None of this felt wrong at first. In fact, it felt like competence, like adulthood. I told myself that visibility was overrated, that real influence happened behind the scenes. I believed that if I kept things running, if I stayed calm and capable, I was earning my place. And for a long time, that belief was reinforced by the absence of conflict. No one argued with me. No one dismissed me outright. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that's when it started. That's the thing about becoming invisible. It doesn't happen through cruelty. It happens through comfort. At home, decisions were made around me, not against me. Plans shifted without consultation. Assumptions formed about my availability, my preferences, my limits. If dinner was late, I adjusted. If schedules overlapped, I rearranged mine. If something needed to be sacrificed, it was usually my time, my rest, my opinion. Not because anyone demanded it, because everyone expected it, and I complied before the expectation had to be spoken. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt necessary. And necessity can be intoxicating when you've learned that love is tied to usefulness. What no one seemed to notice, not even me at first, was that I was no longer being seen as a full participant. I was a function, a stabilizer. Someone whose presence was felt most when it was absent, and even then, only briefly. If I was tired, it went unnoticed. If I was quiet, it was normal. If I withdrew a little, it was assumed I was fine. I told myself this was just how long-term relationships worked. That passion settled into routine. That mutual respect didn't require constant acknowledgement. I believed that being low maintenance was a virtue. I wore it like a badge of honor, even as it erased me. The truth is, no one sat me down and decided I would be invisible. I trained people how to treat me by never asking for more, by stepping in before being invited, by saying it's okay when it wasn't, and meaning it just enough to keep going. Looking back, I can see how clearly defined my role was. I was the background structure, reliable, replaceable, quiet, and at the time I thought that was strength. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. That's what makes it easy to dismiss, even now, if I'm not careful. It was an ordinary weekday evening, the kind that blends into every other. Dinner plans had shifted, again, because something else had come up. A last-minute change that affected everyone, but somehow landed squarely on me to adjust around. I remember standing in the kitchen looking at a pan that was already heating and hearing the decision made from the other room. Not discussed. Decided. It was said casually with the confidence of someone who assumes agreement without needing to check. We'll just do it another night. Clara's fine. My name was used as punctuation. A period at the end of the sentence. I didn't say anything. I turned the stove off. I told myself it didn't matter. That flexibility was part of being supportive. That this was a small thing, not worth correcting. And it was small, on its own. That's the part people don't understand when they ask later why you didn't speak up sooner. You don't speak up because nothing feels big enough yet. But I felt it. A brief, sharp awareness, like realizing you've been standing in a draft. Not pain, just discomfort. I noticed that no one had looked at me when the decision was made. No one asked if I minded. The assumption wasn't malicious. It was efficient. And that efficiency was built on my silence. I brushed it off and moved on. That was my reflex. I adjusted the plan in my head, recalculated the evening, and redirected my energy. I even smiled when I joined them in the living room, carrying the quiet satisfaction of having handled it without fuss. That smile was genuine enough to fool everyone, including me. Later that night, lying in bed, the moment replayed, not as an argument, but as a question. When had my consent become optional? I didn't phrase it that way at the time. I just felt a vague unease, the sense that something had shifted by a fraction of an inch. Not enough to see, but enough to feel if you were paying attention. The next day, life continued as normal. No apology came because none was expected. No conversation followed because nothing had technically gone wrong. That's how these cuts work. They leave no visible wound. They don't disrupt the narrative of everything's fine. I started noticing other moments like it, not because they were new, but because the first one had sharpened my awareness. A scheduled change announced instead of discussed. A comment about my availability made as if it were a fixed trait. A decision justified by, "You don't mind." Each time I said nothing. Each time I told myself it was easier this way. Everyone else ignored these moments because they could. They didn't register as problems from the outside. From their perspective, things were functioning smoothly. I was accommodating, I was calm, I was still smiling. There was no conflict to resolve, but I remembered them. Not in a bitter way, more like mental bookmarks. Tiny flags I didn't yet know the purpose of. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't rehearse speeches in the shower. I just began to notice patterns. And once you start noticing, it's hard to stop. The first small cut didn't hurt enough to change anything. It wasn't supposed to. Its only job was to test whether I would react. I didn't. So the system adjusted accordingly. That's what I didn't understand then. Silence doesn't keep the peace. It teaches people how much space they're allowed to take. After the first small cut, nothing collapsed. No one pulled away. No arguments erupted. In fact, things seemed smoother. That's how I justified what came next. When you don't push back, life often gets quieter on the surface. Fewer discussions, fewer negotiations, fewer moments where anyone has to slow down and consider someone else. At first, I told myself I was being practical. Everyone was busy. Everyone was tired. It made sense to be the flexible one. I had more bandwidth, or at least that's what I believed. So when plans were made without me, I filled in the gaps. When assumptions were made about my time, I reshaped my day. When my preferences weren't asked for, I decided they probably didn't matter that much anyway. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition paired with rationalization. I began editing myself preemptively. If a thought felt inconvenient, I swallowed it. If an opinion might complicate things, I softened it or kept it to myself. I told myself I was choosing harmony over ego, that I was mature enough not to need constant validation. What I didn't see was how often I was choosing everyone else over myself and calling it peace. The language around me reinforced it. You're so easy to work with. You're not like other people. You don't get upset over small stuff. We knew you'd understand. Each sentence sounded like praise, but each one carried an expectation. Understanding became my assigned reaction, not a choice. At home, my role solidified. I was the default yes, the emotional buffer. If someone was stressed, I absorbed it. If someone was irritated, I adjusted. If something needed to be sacrificed, it was quietly assumed I'd handle it. Not because I was asked, but because I always had. And I kept telling myself I was fine. That's the most dangerous lie in a situation like this. Not because it's false in an obvious way, but because it's partially true. I wasn't falling apart. I wasn't miserable every second. I laughed. I functioned. I got things done. From the outside, I looked stable. From the inside, something was flattening. I started noticing how rarely I was surprised. Not in a good way. I could predict outcomes because the script never changed. My needs were the variable that got adjusted out. Over time, that predictability felt less like security and more like confinement. Still, I didn't speak up. Part of me believed that if I just stayed consistent, things would eventually rebalance, that people would notice my effort and respond with care. Another part of me was afraid of what would happen if I disrupted the role I'd been playing so well. When you're valued for being easy, asserting yourself feels like a risk. So I normalized what was happening. I reframed it. I told myself stories that made it bearable. I said, this is just a phase. This is what commitment looks like. Not everything has to be about me. All of those statements are true, in isolation. Together, they can erase you. The people around me didn't change overnight. They just leaned into the version of me that asked for nothing. And because I didn't resist, because I kept functioning, it became the new normal. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, waits to see if you'll object, and when you don't, it settles in like furniture. By the time I realized how much I was giving up, it felt too late to point to a single moment and say, "This is where you crossed a line." The line had moved gradually, and I had moved with it. It wasn't until much later that I understood something important. I hadn't just drifted into invisibility. I had been assigned a role, and I had accepted it without realizing there was a choice. The role was simple. I was the reliable one, the one who wouldn't complain, the one who could be counted on to carry weight quietly. Once that role was established, everything else organized itself around it. Expectations hardened, assumptions filled in the gaps, and any behavior that didn't fit the role felt disruptive, even inappropriate. I noticed it the first time I hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely visible. Someone suggested a plan that would require me to rearrange my schedule again. I paused, just a second longer than usual, long enough to consider whether I wanted to say yes automatically. And in that pause, I saw it, the mild confusion on their face. Not concern, not curiosity, confusion, as if a familiar object had been placed in the wrong room. "Oh," they said lightly. "I just assumed." That sentence followed me for days. I just assumed. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an explanation. It was a statement of how I was perceived, not as someone with preferences, but as a constant, like background music, like a setting that didn't need to be adjusted. Once I saw the role clearly, I saw it everywhere. In how conversation skipped over me when decisions were being finalized, in how my agreement was treated as a formality, if it was sought at all, in how my contributions were noticed only when they were missing. I wasn't the decision maker. I was the support system. And support systems aren't meant to be consulted. They're meant to hold. The most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed. No one was being overtly unkind. No one was shouting or demanding. The role existed because it worked. It made life easier for everyone else. And because I had played it well for so long, it felt natural to them and familiar to me. There's a strange comfort in being useful. It gives you purpose. It gives you a script. As long as you follow it, you belong. I think that's why I stayed in that role longer than I should have. Stepping out of it felt like stepping into uncertainty. Who would I be if I wasn't the one who fixed things quietly? I realized then that I had trained the people around me not to see my limits, not because they were cruel, but because I had never enforced any. I had blurred the line between generosity and self-erasure so completely that even I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The role didn't require my presence as a person. It required my availability as a function. And functions, once relied upon, are rarely thanked. They're just expected to keep working. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me tired, a deep, settled fatigue, not of the body, but of the self. I could feel how much energy it took to maintain the version of me that fit so neatly into everyone else's life. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had avoided for years. What happens if I stop? I didn't answer it yet. I wasn't ready. But once the question exists, it doesn't go away. It waits. It watches. And it changes how you see everything that follows. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no breaking point, no dramatic realization that forced clarity. It was an ordinary morning, quiet enough that nothing competed with my thoughts. Those are the moments when truth tends to surface, when there's no noise to drown it out. I was alone in the kitchen, early light filtering through the window, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't really wanted. I'd made it out of habit the same way I did everything else. I remember standing there, not thinking about anyone else for once, and feeling a strange emptiness where urgency usually lived. There was nothing I needed to fix, no schedule to rearrange, no mood to anticipate, and without those tasks, I felt exposed. That's when it occurred to me, not as a thought, but as a quiet knowing, that I didn't actually know what I wanted anymore. Not in big, life-altering terms, Just small things. How I preferred to spend a free hour. What kind of rest actually restored me. What it felt like to make a choice without running it through someone else's needs first. The realization wasn't painful. It was sobering. I saw, with uncomfortable clarity, how long it had been since I'd asked myself those questions. How easily I'd replaced my own internal compass with external expectations. I had become efficient at responding, not at choosing. Standing there, I didn't feel angry at anyone. I felt honest with myself for the first time in years. And that honesty came with a quiet resolve, not to confront, not to demand, just to stop moving automatically. That was the shift. Nothing changed externally that day. I went to work, I answered emails, I smiled when spoken to. But internally, something had loosened, a grip I hadn't realized I was maintaining. I noticed my impulses to jump in, to smooth things over, to volunteer, and for the first time I questioned them before acting. It felt awkward, like using a muscle that had been dormant. There was a moment later that afternoon when a familiar expectation hovered in the air, waiting for me to fill the space. I didn't. I let the silence sit. It was uncomfortable, for me more than anyone else, but it didn't break anything. That's when I understood that my constant availability wasn't the glue holding everything together. It was just convenient. The shift wasn't about rebellion. It was about awareness. Once I saw how much of my behavior was driven by habit rather than intention, I couldn't unsee it. I started noticing how often I acted out of obligation instead of alignment. How rarely I checked in with myself before saying yes. That day didn't change my life immediately. It changed the direction I was facing. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my silence didn't have to be a default setting, that my value wasn't tied to how little space I took up, that choosing myself didn't require an explanation. I didn't announce this to anyone. I didn't need to. The shift was internal, and that made it powerful. It meant that whatever came next would be a choice, not a reaction. And once you realize you have a choice, continuing as before becomes impossible. Before that day, my silence had been automatic. It was reflexive, almost unconscious, a learned response shaped by years of prioritizing ease over truth. After the shift, silence became something else entirely. It became deliberate. I started noticing the moments when I would normally step in, the pauses where I'd usually offer a solution, fill an awkward gap, or volunteer my time before anyone had to ask. Instead of acting, I waited, not to prove a point, just to see what would happen if I didn't intervene. What happened was nothing catastrophic. Conversations continued, problems resolved themselves, sometimes less efficiently, sometimes with a bit more friction, but they did resolve. The world didn't collapse without my constant management. That realization was both relieving and unsettling. It meant I hadn't been as indispensable as I'd believed. I had been helpful, yes, but also overextended. Others, however, interpreted my new quiet in familiar ways. They assumed I was tired, distracted, maybe a little withdrawn. Silence, after all, was still in character for me. What they didn't see was that this silence carried intention. I was listening differently, observing without immediately responding, letting patterns reveal themselves without my interference. And patterns did reveal themselves. I noticed who stepped up when I didn't, who became irritated, who filled the space with assumptions. I noticed how often my absence from a role created mild inconvenience, and how quickly that inconvenience was framed as unexpected, even unfair. Not because I'd promised anything, but because I'd always delivered before. No one asked me directly what had changed. That would have required acknowledging that something had. Instead, there were small comments. "You've been quiet lately." "Everything okay?" I answered honestly, but briefly. "I'm fine." And I was, just not in the way they were used to. This was the beginning of what I now think of as moving inward. I conserved energy. I stopped over-explaining. I let myself be misunderstood in small ways. That was harder than it sounds. When you're accustomed to being clear and accommodating, allowing ambiguity feels almost irresponsible. But I learned that clarity offered too freely becomes expectation. And expectation, left unchecked, becomes entitlement. My silence, chosen this time, created space. Space to think. Space to notice what I actually felt. Space to consider options I'd never allowed myself to entertain. I began documenting, not out of suspicion, but out of self-respect. Writing down patterns, tracking responsibilities, noting where my effort exceeded acknowledgement. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was preparation for clarity. The people around me mistook my restraint for the same old compliance. That was the irony. They didn't realize that by not reacting, I was gathering information, that by stepping back, I was finally seeing the full picture. Silence had always been my default. Now it was my leverage. And the most important thing I learned during that time was this. When you stop performing a role, you begin to see who relies on it and how much they've been taking without noticing. What they never noticed was how much I was learning, because from the outside, nothing looked different enough to raise concern. I still showed up. I still did my job. I still participated. The shift was internal, and because it wasn't loud, it went undetected. That invisibility, once a weakness, became my advantage. I began paying attention to systems instead of moments. At home, I started mapping the flow of responsibilities. Who initiated decisions? Who benefited from them? Who absorbed the consequences when plans changed? I wrote these things down, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, patterns, repetition. It was like stepping out of a fog and realizing there had always been a structure. I just hadn't named it. At work, I did the same. I tracked how often I stepped in to prevent problems versus how often my role was formally acknowledged. I noticed how frequently I was copied on emails after decisions had already been made, how often my input was requested only when something went wrong. None of this was shocking on its own. Together it formed a clear picture. I also began learning, quietly. I refreshed skills I'd let sit dormant, read about financial planning, legal boundaries, project leverage, not with a sense of urgency, but with curiosity. I asked myself what independence would actually require, not emotionally, but practically. Time, resources, knowledge, options. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered. No one questioned why I was suddenly less available. They adjusted in small ways, often unconsciously. That told me something important. My constant overfunctioning hadn't been necessary. It had been convenient. I stopped correcting misconceptions unless they affected me directly. I let people underestimate my awareness. I let them believe I was still operating on autopilot. That assumption gave me space to think clearly without interference. Emotionally, this period was quiet. There was no rush of empowerment, no dramatic sense of awakening, just a steady accumulation of understanding. Each observation removed a layer of self-blame. I wasn't failing at balance. I had been carrying more than my share. They never noticed the notebook, the way I'd pause before responding, the fact that I asked fewer questions but listened more carefully. They didn't notice because they had never needed to look closely before. Things had always worked, and that was the point. When someone has been invisible long enough, their stillness doesn't register as change. It registers as stability. That misinterpretation allowed me to prepare without opposition. This wasn't about winning. It was about seeing clearly enough to choose well when the time came. Because once you understand the system you're in, you also understand where the exits are. The reveal didn't come from a single discovery. There was no secret file, no shocking confession, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It came quietly, through accumulation, like water rising millimeter by millimeter until you finally realize your feet are wet. One evening, I sat alone with my notebook open, pages filled, not with feelings but with facts, dates, responsibilities, financial contributions, time spent, emotional labor given. I hadn't set out to prove anything. I'd only wanted clarity. But clarity has a way of organizing itself into truth. And the truth was simple and unsettling. I had far more leverage than I thought, not power in the dramatic sense, not something to be used against anyone, but structural leverage. I was central to systems that ran smoothly precisely because no one had ever questioned my role in them. I handled logistics others didn't want to think about. I managed continuity. I held information, routines, and stability that had quietly become essential. Because I never demanded recognition, my contribution had become invisible, but it had not become insignificant. That realization didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me still. I saw how easily things could unravel if I simply stopped. Not out of spite, just out of alignment. If I withdrew my excess effort, not all of it, just the unspoken, unpaid, unacknowledged parts, there would be consequences. Not catastrophic ones, but real ones, inconvenient ones, ones that would force others to confront what they'd taken for granted. For the first time, I understood that my invisibility had been masking my influence, and with that understanding came restraint. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. I didn't hint. I didn't change my tone or posture. I let the knowledge sit with me, privately, until it lost its emotional charge and became neutral. That was important. I didn't want to act from resentment. I wanted to act from clarity. This was the moment where I truly put myself first, not by demanding anything, but by acknowledging reality as it was. I allowed myself to see my own value without needing it to be mirrored back to me. That internal validation changed how I moved. I began asking different questions. Not how do I keep this working, but what do I actually want to carry? Not what will happen if I say no, but what is the cost of always saying yes? The reveal wasn't about what others had done. It was about what I had been allowing. And once I saw that, there was no unseeing it. I understood then that any choice I made from this point on would be irreversible, not because it would hurt anyone, but because it would fundamentally alter how I saw myself. Going back to automatic self-erasure was no longer an option. I closed the notebook that night with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not excitement, just certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. Knowing you have leverage and choosing how to use it are two very different things. For a while after the private reveal, I did nothing. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be sure that whatever I chose came from intention, not reaction. Awareness creates options, but it also creates responsibility. Once you see clearly, you can't pretend ignorance anymore. I began laying out the paths in front of me, quietly, honestly. One option was to speak up, to explain how unseen I'd felt, to ask for change, renegotiate roles, hope for understanding. It was the most socially acceptable choice. It promised dialogue, maybe even repair. But it also required something I no longer had, the willingness to educate people about my worth. Another option was to stay as I was, just more aware, to keep things functioning, but with the emotional detachment. That path offered stability with minimal disruption. It also required me to live with the knowledge that I was choosing comfort over integrity. I knew, deep down, that I would resent myself for that. There was a third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, the irreversible one, to stop overfunctioning completely, not dramatically, not all at once, but decisively, to reorganize my life around what was sustainable for me, regardless of how others adapted, to let systems fail where they depended on my silent sacrifice, to accept the consequences without defending or explaining myself. This option didn't involve confrontation. It involved boundaries so clear they didn't require discussion. The weight of that choice settled in slowly. I thought about time, how much of it I'd spent maintaining equilibrium at my own expense. I thought about the quiet fatigue I carried, the version of myself I barely recognized anymore. I asked myself a hard question. If nothing changed, how would I feel a year from now? The answer came without hesitation. I would feel hollow. That realization made the decision simple, even if it wasn't easy. I chose the path that aligned with the person I wanted to become, not the one I had been trained to be. I chose to act without seeking permission. I chose to accept misunderstanding as a temporary cost of self-respect. This wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about honoring a truth I could no longer ignore. Once the decision was made, something in me settled. The constant background tension, the need to monitor, adjust, anticipate, began to fade. I wasn't energized. I was grounded. There's a difference. I didn't announce my choice. I didn't mark the moment. From the outside, nothing had happened yet. But internally, the line had been crossed. And once you cross it, there is no going back. After the decision, I moved carefully, not cautiously, but deliberately. There's a difference. Caution is driven by fear. Deliberation is driven by clarity. I wasn't trying to avoid consequences. I was choosing the ones I could live with. The first thing I did was stop filling gaps that weren't mine. When something was overlooked, I let it be overlooked. When a detail was missed, I didn't rush to correct it. When confusion arose, I waited to see who would step in. This wasn't passive-aggressive. I didn't sigh or make comments. I simply stopped preemptively rescuing situations that had never been my responsibility to begin with. At the same time, I reorganized my own life quietly. I separated what I actually needed to manage from what I'd been carrying out of habit. I adjusted my finances to reflect independence rather than convenience. I made sure I understood exactly where I stood, legally, practically, emotionally. Knowledge creates steadiness. I wanted mine to be unshakable. I also reclaimed time in small, almost invisible ways. I blocked hours on my calendar that weren't negotiable. I stopped explaining my availability. I answered questions directly without cushioning. I can't do that. That doesn't work for me. No justification, no apology, just statements of fact. No one reacted strongly at first. That was telling. The absence of immediate resistance confirmed what I'd already suspected. My previous over-involvement had masked how much others relied on my quiet labor. As long as things kept working, no one questioned how. When they didn't, confusion set in, but not awareness. Not yet. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd become less engaged, more distant. But internally, I felt more present than I had in years. I wasn't scattered. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was simply living within my own limits and letting the rest adjust. There were moments of discomfort, silence where I would once have spoken, pauses where I would have smoothed things over. I sat with those moments instead of rushing past them. I reminded myself that discomfort wasn't danger. It was just unfamiliar. What mattered was that I didn't explain myself into invisibility again. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about alignment without performance. I wasn't trying to be understood in real time. I was building a life that didn't require constant translation. By the time the consequences began to surface, my foundation was already set. I wasn't scrambling. I wasn't second-guessing. I was ready to let the reality of my absence speak for itself, and it would. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They crept in quietly, the same way everything else had. At first, it was confusion, small disruptions, missed details that used to be handled without anyone noticing, a schedule that didn't quite line up, a responsibility that hovered in the air longer than usual, waiting for someone to claim it. No one connected these moments to me, not immediately. Instead, there was mild irritation, aimless, unfocused. People assumed the system was having an off week, that something external was to blame. I watched this with a strange calm, not because I was detached, but because I was finally seeing cause and effect without being inside it. Then the questions started. Not the kind that reflect concern, but the kind that assume continuity. Did this get done? Weren't we supposed to? I thought you usually... Each question stopped just short of naming me, as if saying my name would make the expectation too obvious. I answered only what was asked. No more, no less. If something was my responsibility, I handled it. If it wasn't, I didn't absorb it. That boundary, simple as it sounds, changed the entire dynamic. Tasks didn't disappear. They just became visible, and visibility creates accountability. What surprised me was how quickly discomfort turned into unease. Without my constant mediation, small frictions became noticeable. Conversations stalled, decisions took longer. People realized, without quite admitting it, that a layer of support had been removed. Not maliciously, just factually. There was a moment when someone said, almost offhandedly, "Things feel more complicated lately." I nodded. I didn't explain. Complexity had always been there. I had just been managing it silently. Now, others had to feel it. Still, no one confronted me directly. That would have required acknowledging how much they'd relied on my quiet labor. Instead, there were subtle shifts in tone, hesitations, a kind of searching, like people were trying to locate something they'd misplaced but couldn't remember owning. I remained calm, consistent, unreactive. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was letting reality settle into its new shape. Internally, I felt steady. There was no guilt because I wasn't withholding anything I'd agreed to give. There was no triumph because this wasn't a victory. It was simply the natural outcome of alignment. The consequences weren't punishment. They were information. And as they accumulated, it became clear that the version of me everyone had relied on was not coming back. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, the window for fixing it had already closed. The confusion had hardened into anxiety, the mild irritation into a quiet panic that no one wanted to name. Systems that had once run smoothly now required effort. Conversations that used to glide now stalled. Decisions lingered, unfinished, waiting for a kind of invisible hand that was no longer reaching in. That's when the tone shifted. Suddenly, there was more checking in, more casual questions disguised as concern. "Are you okay? You seem different lately. Did I do something?" The timing was what stood out to me. These questions didn't come when I was stretched thin or quietly overextending. They came when my absence created discomfort. I answered honestly but selectively. "I'm fine. Nothing's wrong." Both were true. What I didn't say was that something had changed permanently and that it wasn't up for negotiation. There were attempts to restore the old balance without acknowledging it directly. Small gestures, slightly more consideration. A few moments of inclusion that felt rehearsed, like someone remembering lines to a play they hadn't bothered to learn until now. It wasn't manipulation. It was panic masked as politeness. But it was too late. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because I could see the difference between temporary adjustment and genuine recognition. What they wanted wasn't to see me. It was to get the system back. And once you recognize that distinction, you can't unsee it. I noticed how quickly the effort faded when things didn't immediately return to normal. How easily the responsibility drifted back toward me, testing whether I'd step in again. I didn't. And with each failed attempt to revert, the realization deepened. This wasn't a phase. I wasn't tired. I wasn't distracted. I was done overfunctioning. There was a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when I felt the finality of it. Not sadness, not anger, just closure. The kind that doesn't need a conversation to validate it. They hadn't noticed when I was slowly disappearing. They noticed only when I stopped compensating. And that told me everything I needed to know. Fixing it now would have required going back to being unseen. And that was the one thing I would not do again. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look the way people imagine these moments do. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, no list of grievances, laid out like evidence. It happened in the middle of an ordinary conversation, almost by accident, when avoidance finally ran out of space. Someone said carefully, "We should talk." I agreed. We sat down. The air was tense, but not hostile. More uncertain than anything. I could see the effort it took for them to begin, the way they searched for language that wouldn't accuse, but still explain the discomfort they'd been feeling. They spoke about distance, about things feeling off, about missing how easy everything used to be. I listened without interrupting. When it was my turn, I didn't defend myself. I didn't list examples. I didn't reach for the notebook or the patterns or the months of quiet effort. I spoke plainly because clarity didn't require detail anymore. I realized I was doing more than I could sustain, I said. So I stopped. That was it. No blame, no emotional charge, just a statement of fact. They waited, as if expecting more. An apology maybe, or reassurance that things would return to normal. When that didn't come, I could see the confusion surface again. The same confusion I'd noticed months earlier when I hesitated instead of automatically agreeing. "So, can we fix it?" they asked. I took a moment, not for effect, but because I wanted my answer to be accurate. "This is the fix," I said, "for me." There was no anger in my voice, no resentment. That's what made it land. When you don't sound defensive, people can't argue with your tone. They're left with the truth itself. I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't negotiating terms. I was informing them of a boundary that already existed. The conversation didn't escalate because there was nothing to push against. I wasn't trying to convince them of anything. I was simply standing where I now stood. They nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition of change, of loss, of something that couldn't be undone with a promise to do better. When we stood up, the relationship hadn't exploded, but it had shifted permanently. And strangely, I felt lighter, not because the conversation went perfectly, but because I hadn't abandoned myself to keep it calm. That was new. And it was enough. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but not smaller. The silence is different. It no longer comes from suppression or fatigue. It comes from choice, from knowing when my voice matters and when my presence doesn't need to be explained. I don't fill space automatically anymore. I let it exist. And if it remains empty, I don't rush to blame myself. My days look simpler on the surface, fewer obligations, fewer invisible tasks, less emotional bookkeeping. What that simplicity gives me is depth. I notice myself again, my reactions, my limits, my preferences. I don't override them for the sake of ease. I still care. That part of me didn't disappear. But care is no longer something I give away by default. It's something I offer where it's reciprocated, where it's respected, where it doesn't require me to shrink. The people around me have adjusted in their own ways. Some stepped up, some drifted, some remain confused, unsure how to relate to a version of me that no longer anticipates their needs before they're spoken. I let that be their work, not mine. What changed most wasn't my circumstances. It was my internal posture. I don't measure my value by how smooth everything runs. I don't feel responsible for other people's comfort at the expense of my own alignment. I no longer mistake being needed for being seen. There's a steadiness in that. A calm that doesn't come from approval, but from coherence. My actions match my values. My yes means yes. My no doesn't require justification. I'm not bitter. That surprises people sometimes. But bitterness requires ongoing engagement with resentment. I chose closure instead. I took what I learned and integrated it without carrying the weight of blame. Being invisible taught me how systems work. Choosing myself taught me how freedom works. Now, when I walk into a room, at home, at work, anywhere, I don't wonder how to be useful. I ask a quieter, more important question. Do I want to be here as I am? If the answer is yes, I stay. If it's no, I don't contort myself to fit. That's who I am now. For a long time, I thought invisibility was something other people did to me. something imposed, something unfair. But the truth, harder and more empowering, is that invisibility is often a collaboration, not because we want it, but because we're taught that being agreeable is safer than being clear, that being needed is close enough to being loved. This story isn't about blaming anyone. The people in my life didn't wake up one day and decide not to see me. They followed the shape I made for myself, the shape that fit around their needs, their habits, their comfort. And I maintained that shape because it felt easier than risking disruption. Until it didn't. The moral isn't leave or confront or demand more. The moral is quieter than that. It's this: what you tolerate repeatedly becomes your role. And roles, once established, don't change through explanation. They change through behavior. Putting myself first didn't require cruelty. It didn't require revenge or dramatic exits. It required consistency. The kind that feels uncomfortable at first because it breaks a familiar pattern. The kind that teaches people who you are now, not who you used to be. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: you don't have to disappear to keep the peace. And you don't owe anyone access to the parts of you that are depleted. Quiet boundaries are still boundaries. Calm decisions are still decisions. Invisibility ends the moment you stop performing it. If you've been listening and recognizing pieces of your own life in this story, you're not alone, and you're not late. Awareness doesn't demand immediate action. It just asks for honesty with yourself first. So I'll leave you with one question, and I genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. In what part of your life have you been quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because it felt safer than changing how others see you? Thank you for listening.